We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisades Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is the head writer for the Doomberg team on Substack. How are you today, Doomberg?
Hey, Tom, doing great. Pleasure to be back with you. It's been a long time and looking forward to a really great discussion.
I'm looking forward to it as well. And, I really have to express some gratitude to you guys. You and your team publish some very well-researched and well-written articles that really start by giving the reader context of complex subjects that they might not be familiar with, and then, relaying that information and how that actually affects them. And like you say, it's been a little while since we've spoken, but I'm looking forward to digging into the seemingly endless stream of important discussions that we need to have here.
Yeah, same here. It's been a bit of a whirlwind for us since we last talked, but also just the news flow is, I've joked before, there are forums that when we started Doomberg, one of my concerns was that we would run out of stuff to write about, and does not seem like that's going to be an issue anytime soon because the news flow has just been incredible. Just as we were chatting a bit before we came on air, the story out of Europe, which I'm sure we'll get into, which developed in the last 24 hours, is just sort of a really potentially a very staggering geopolitical event. And yet again, like we'll be publishing about it tomorrow, hopefully, or the next day. And it's just incredible, like day after day, the speed with which the news is coming in is just incredible. And it's a lot to keep up with. And thankfully, we've been able to do so far.
Absolutely. And again, kind of what we were chatting about a little bit before, working together and seemingly these synergies that have developed between content creators, it's really helpful to be able to put all these pieces together and get a better idea of kind of the downstream effects of how one event can actually have these real life consequences for the rest of the world, right?
Yeah, maybe we could pivot to what happened yesterday as an example, if you'd like to go there. But
yeah, sure. Let's start with that.
Yeah. So, yesterday, news headline broke in the morning, which was a pretty curious one, which was there was a pressure drop in Nord Stream 2, which is a brand new natural gas pipeline that connects Russia directly to Germany underwater. And it has never actually delivered gas to Germany. Famously, it cost many billions of dollars and took many years to construct. And this was a very controversial project because it circumvented land-based pipelines that go through Ukraine. And of course, there's a conflict going on right now between Ukraine and Russia. And that pipeline never really got started, but it was pressurized. And it runs parallel to Nord Stream 1, which is a main artery through which natural gas reaches Europe from Russia. And the headline was that there was a pressure release or a leak, a pressure drop at the pipeline of Nord Stream 2. And during the day, there was some speculation, since this pipeline had not yet been turned on, maybe it was just a design flaw, maybe it was an accident, who knows. But then a second headline hit, which really sort of crystallized the event that was actually transpiring, which is a major section of Nord Stream 1 was also damaged. And so what it looks like as of the time of this recording, that there has been a major act of sabotage on a really critical energy artery that we believe is hugely significant on a go-forward basis for the geopolitical tensions, the energy crisis in Europe. And there's a very, very high risk that other dominoes might fall here, even by the time we publish this podcast, that can turn what is sort of a manageable conflict right now into a full-blown, much more serious escalation, which we're obviously hoping against. But this is a very, very big deal because it really changes the dynamics potentially in a permanent way, depending on the level of damage and whether or not those pipelines will be repaired. This is a big deal.
So let's talk through a little bit of those possible, let's say, geopolitical ramifications there. Even if we live in an ideal world and tomorrow we wake up and the conflict is over, let's just say we have a crystal ball and everybody gets what they want. And, Europe kind of comes to their senses and realizes that they're going to need the supply of Russian gas that they have relied upon to stay warm in the winter for so many years. Now, with possible permanent loss of the ability to deliver that gas through those two pipelines, how does that affect them going forward?
So we should say, with a giant disclaimer, that you and I are speaking with limited information at the time of this recording.
Absolutely.
And as a consequence of that, we will be necessarily indulging in some speculation, however well informed it might be. Mm-hmm. And it is entirely possible, probably even probable, that we will get something significant wrong and things will turn out differently than we will speculate in the next few minutes. A lot depends on the degree of the damage to these pipelines. There's probably, I've been speaking with, we're blessed with a very large network from our time in industry and also because of the wonders of the internet and the interconnectivity of Twitter and Slack and pick your favorite communication tool. I was exchanging messages with an expert just this morning who, specializes in deep sea oil and gas projects. And his view was, in a perfect world, if the damage was confined and everybody, all hands on deck, let's fix this right away, you're probably looking at 20 to 25 weeks of lead time for some of the critical repair pieces and equipment that you would need to get this job done. And we're facing, ever harsher conditions as winter progresses here. That puts Europe in 2022, 2023 winter in a real bad place. If we had both pipelines healthy and peace was achieved tomorrow, you could turn both of those pipelines on full blast, then you would solve Europe's energy crisis immediately. That option is now off the table for all intents and purposes. If the damage is so severe that the cost to repair it is so pronounced, and by the way, who is going to repair it and who's going to pay for it? Because there's no gas flowing through it. It's a temporarily, at least, a non-economic decision to repair it. If it's not repaired, then this is a permanent sort of effectively destruction of those two pipelines. This condemns Europe to multiple winters of significant challenge. Much of the gas that is in storage today for Europe as they are getting ready for the upcoming winter was put there via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which was flowing regularly for most of the year. So forget this winter. When the tanks are almost empty come spring, what's Europe going to do? Mm-hmm. So again, we are speculating. We don't have the knowledge. There's sporadic reports on Twitter that the damage could be very significant. There's a lot of off-the-record comments in the early reporting. The analogy that we probably will use in the piece that we're going to write up on this is sort of, if you remember on 9/11 for most people, obviously not the people who were on planes that were hijacked and may they rest in peace, but for most people, 9/11 started when the second plane hit that building, right? Because when the first plane hit, kind of were like, oh, was that a small plane? Was it an accident? And people on television were commenting and there was a lot of confusion, the sort of fog of war. But when that second plane hit, you knew immediately that this was a deliberate act. And that was the same feeling we had yesterday when we saw the second headline, that not only was Nord Stream 2 damaged and brought offline, but Nord Stream 1 was as well. And obviously nothing compares to 9/11, and we're not trying to make that comparison flippantly. Mm-hmm. But 9/11 changed the world forever. And if Nord Stream 1 and 2 are permanently knocked off, like if the equivalent of, quote, the building's collapsing, in this case, the pipelines are irreparable, that would change the chess pieces in a permanent way and simultaneously open up a path function of risk that many people thought was unlikely. Because the real danger here is if we're going to normalize the destruction of critical energy infrastructure choke points, all bets are off. Now, who knows who did it? Who knows what their motivations were? We have no idea. We don't care to speculate. The internet is filled with people claiming they think it's, A, B, and C. And we don't want to indulge in that. Regardless of who did it, somebody did it, and somebody else knows that they didn't do it and may respond in a certain way. And so this is a very, very dangerous time, a very precarious time. A friend of mine joked with me that next thing you know, an LNG carrier filled with US natural gas will run into an iceberg. Like, this could escalate very quickly. This is a very, very, very systemic event.
Mm-hmm. And of course, just for a little bit of context, we're speaking kind of midday here on Tuesday, the 27th of September. And it's interesting, some of the parallels, I guess, to 9/11 as we're speaking about that. But one of the things I did want to touch on with you was, how Europe's gas supplies actually look for the coming winter. I've read articles stating that their inventory levels are high, but is this only really half the story? Like, how do they distribute that without pressure on the back end to push that gas through?
Yeah, it's actually a third of the story, because there's a high variability in country by country how much gas they can store relative to the amount that they use. So for example, in the United Kingdom, they only have the capacity to store 1% of their annual natural gas needs. So I ask you, now what does it matter what the percent of storage is in the UK? It's irrelevant. Germany, 24, 25%. Austria, 75 to 80%. So in Austria, if your tanks are, quote, 90% full, that's a big deal. Mm-hmm. You're going to do just fine this winter. Now, there is also another dimension, which is the amount that you can pull out on any particular day is limited. And as you mentioned and alluded to, it does shrink as the tanks become more empty. But in the UK, storage is irrelevant. Across the European Union, it's something like 23, 24%, I think, that they can store. So there's two dimensions. There's how much do you need that you can store practically, and then how much can you pull out on any particular day to avoid shorting the system.
Mm-hmm. And I guess maybe one more dimension that would be worth mentioning is how cold and how brutal the winter is actually going to be too, right?
Correct. So in our view, Europe is entering the winter with insufficient molecules. And now the only question that remains is how efficiently will they allocate those and what signals will they use to allocate those? And then it's basically a roll of the dice on the weather. And, you know, as we're talking, Javier Blas, who's an energy columnist from Doomberg and very well respected, put out a tweet saying the size of the Nord Stream pipeline gas leak is huge. According to the Danish armed forces, it measures about 1 kilometer in diameter. That's a big deal. So we shall see. Again, as I began this whole discussion with, like, you and I are sort of spitballing here with limited information and discussing the range of possibilities. And it's undoubtedly true that your listeners will be able to access far more information than we have today as the passage of time reveals the true extent of what we believe might be a potentially very, very systemically important event that has just occurred.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So coming back to, I guess, some of the real world implications of this, is Japan facing a form of, this reality coming to a head by rushing to reopen 9 of its nuclear reactors in the middle of this energy crisis? As we've talked about, it has now stepped up exponentially. But, Japan is one of the largest importers of LNG in the world. So how is that affecting them?
Yeah, it's a great question. We just put out a piece, as you know, called The Battle for the Yen, where we speculated that despite their best efforts to bring some sanity back to their energy policy, it might be too little too late. And the yen, the Bank of Japan, Japanese government intervened in the currency markets last week to try to strengthen the yen and to abate its ongoing weakness, which has been incredible and historic. And there's no question that, as we've written about for more than a year, at the margin, the world is interconnected, and natural gas prices in Europe, while they're bidding for the same incremental LNG carrier that Japan would normally receive. And this is putting a serious pressure on the Japanese currency. Both the Japanese and the Europeans, of course, cannot settle energy in their own local currencies, which is a point that our friend Luke Groman has been making quite extensively. And so they have to, energy is settled in US dollars. And so if they have to weaken their currency to get the molecules they need, then that's what we see. The DXY is exploding higher today. Natural gas, as we're talking, is up something like 20% in Europe on the news of the pipeline's destruction. We'll see how it trades tomorrow when more information is forthcoming. The yen, that the Japanese central bank has drawn a line in the sand and said 145 is the number for the yen. And upon their intervention, it dropped to 141. And as we're talking, it's at 144.85 again. And so looks like the market is fixing to call the bluff of the Central Bank of Japan. And so, yes, they are turning on, actively working to restart 9 nuclear power plants. And as we mentioned in the article, they had cut a deal with Putin to get LNG from a Russian JV. Those are still, of course, settled in US dollars, but it's a very precarious time for Japan. Of course, the UK is going through a historic devaluation, essentially. And the joke is that BOE is the Bank of Emerging Markets. It's really crazy to see what's going on. And so for those who were saying that perhaps we and others who have been flagging this crisis were being a bit alarmist, and that, quote, Europe will survive the winter. As we tweeted recently, we're old enough to remember when we will survive the winter was a pretty low bar. These are developed nations we're talking about that are in deep crisis right now. Mm-hmm. The crisis has arrived. The only thing that remains to be seen is how effectively we deal with the crisis and the depths of it based on events. But this Nord Stream 1-2 pipeline, sort of twin pipeline attacks, because they are attacks. Like, this is not, I think the evidence is pretty clear that this was a deliberate act of sabotage. And that is an extraordinarily profound, unthinkable, really, before this year, that something like this would happen.
Absolutely. And, when we see currencies like this have dramatic moves against the dollar like that, what downstream effects could that have within their financial systems themselves? Do banks stop lending and trade becomes much more difficult to get that energy that they need?
So a fellow content creator and a person we enjoy reading and respect a lot and have helped each other, as we've grown, is Alfonso over at Macro Alf. And he had a great point. We were on a Spaces together, and he made a great point that the model for, let's say, the UK that he is using is that of an emerging market that has large US dollar denominated debt and can't print currency to pay that debt back in nominal terms. So the exogenic shock of an emerging market is generally what leads to, hyperinflationary crises and devaluations and defaults. And because Europe and the UK in particular, let's just focus on the British pound, because they're heading into this winter with no storage and insufficient molecules, it's not like they could just print more pounds to get molecules, because the molecules are settled in US dollars. And that's why his model, which is really hard, of course, for developed economies to envision themselves as being basically Argentina. That's a very fascinating point for us that really resonated. And then I added on that same space that at least the Argentinians are used to it, right? So the population of the United Kingdom is not prepared to A, internalize that they are basically in an emerging market crisis, and B, put up with it, right? And so ironically, the path to social unrest could be a little easier in countries that first have to internalize the fact that they aren't what they thought they were. Everybody in Argentina knows that you don't trust the local currency, that you buy hard assets, that you put some money in gold, that you spend the money as soon as you get it. This is not the mindset of a Western developed nation in Europe. And so it's really a really interesting experiment we're about to run here. Interesting is probably too positive of a word, but you know what I'm trying to say. This is uncharted territory. And so, if you can't print the molecules you need, then you're almost indistinguishable from an emerging market, economic crisis.
And, going back to the idea of how this affects can affect let's say the financial markets, Japan is the largest foreign holder of US Treasuries. So does this pose a larger problem for the US if Japan is maybe forced to sell some of those treasuries to shore up the yen?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, this is again a point that Luke Roman has been hammering home, which is who's going to buy the treasuries? So the Fed has decided that it wants to solve for inflation in the United States. Period. Well, that's going to export a lot of problems to a lot of allies. And Japan is just sort of an early canary in a coal mine here. UK right up there. The strong dollar sort of, and give full credit to Brent Johnson and his famous milkshake theory. This is a real problem. And Luke believes it will cause the Fed to pivot. We shall see. But there's no question that the Japan is the highest foreign owner of US Treasuries. And who's going to be the incremental buyer as the recession that Powell is inducing necessitates more government borrowing to cover the deficit. So what does that do for yields? And what does that do for stocks? And then what does that do for tax collections? Again, another point that Roman, who's very brilliant, and we subscribe to his stuff, Forest for the Trees, and everybody listening should. As tax collections drop, you have to finance a bigger deficit. And if your biggest buyers are selling any asset for liquidity, i.e. US Treasuries, in order to support their own currencies, yields could go very funky pretty soon. And so maybe the Fed quietly starts buying JGBs. Who knows? The old expression is that which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And, something's got to give here pretty soon, in our view, especially with the midterms coming up.
Well, and, part of the point that you bring up in the article, which I found was really interesting about that point of, something that can't go on forever. There has been, I forget the way you put it in the article, but, traders look at the Japanese yen and Japanese bonds as being this no-brainer trade that has ended up being called the widowmaker because it has never broken to the downside or the upside, depending on what we're talking about. And it does somewhat seem like this might be that point where it starts to break. And those people that recognize that trade are finally proven right. As you said, they intervened in the market it dropped back down to 140 and it's already up almost to that line in the sand that they've kind of drawn, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, and if that line in the sand is washed away by a wave, where does it stop? Yeah. What is the natural value of the Japanese yen without the government's thumb on the scale? Now, again, much like the housing crisis, there were people who were totally correct and way too early. And there's no difference between being early and being wrong when it comes to your P&L as an investor. But we shall see again. Then we're very cautious to say in the piece, like, is this the time? Let's look at the evidence. Again, it would be the time until the Fed reverses course, I guess, right?
Right.
So if you're shorting the yen and life is great and it busts through 145 and goes to 150 and 160 and 170, and then you press your bet and you wake up in the morning and Jerome Powell is the world's largest buyer of JGBs, good luck to your trade. And so just the threat of that, I think, can put a lid on things, but we shall see. It's certainly on our board of the top 10 charts we look at every morning when we wake up.
You mentioned Luke Gromen and how interesting and prescient some of his ideas and his articles are. And of course, I had the privilege of talking to him pretty much right at the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm hoping to speak with him here next week again. But I'd like to get your take on how, the situation with the yen and the situation with the British pound in some ways provide Putin with some leverage and a possible way around the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and their energy.
Well, let's be clear, Russian energy is finding its way to the market. And we've long argued, and we think history has validated our view, that one should not want and should not want Russia's energy to be contained within Russia. We should want as much of it to get onto the international market as possible. And we should try to win a war by flooding the market with energy to reduce the price that Putin is receiving, because you're never going to stop his volume from reaching the market, and you shouldn't want it to, because that's only going to drive prices higher and crush our allies, as we've seen. And so from the beginning, there is a critical and fundamental design flaw in the sanctions. We've been very early, we've been very consistent, and we believe we have been validated. Russian energy is finding its way to the market, and by trying to stop it from doing so, we pushed prices higher than they otherwise would have been, and Putin made more money. Full stop.
And in some ways, you're just introducing a middleman that is adding more cost just to get it to market.
Of course. Anybody who spent 10 minutes in an actual commodity business, and we've spent decades, actually running a P&L, understands that price swamps volume. And so these are highly inelastic commodities. And let's do the hypothetical. If we took 50% of Putin's exports off the market tomorrow, the price would more than double and he would make more revenue. And we would inflict a world of pain on the most vulnerable people among us. Some of them are our allies. And so we want every molecule of his on the market, and then we want to swamp the market with even more molecules to drive the price down. If oil were $20 a barrel today, Putin would not be able to fund his war machine. How do you get oil to $20 a barrel? You flood the market with supply. We've been very consistent on this point, and it's true. So to your question, this puts the energy short countries in a world of hurt, especially since they can't settle their energy deficits in local currencies, which is why you're seeing Putin cutting deals with China and India and pick your favorite country to allow them to settle their obligations with him in domestic currencies. And who knows, that we haven't seen the deals, but maybe they are then, making up the difference in gold or something like that. And that's sort of a de-dollarization threat to the current world order. And we'll see how things go. But that's sort of the big concept that Luke has been writing eloquently about for the better part of a decade.
That's actually, you led right into my next question. That is it possible that gold could be needed to settle some of these transactions for these essential energy supplies at some point if enough confidence is lost in those local currencies?
Well, that's the big battle. So that's what, Russia and China and India and perhaps Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Brazil. There's a lot of angst about the US dollar system, especially after the Russian reserves were sanctioned. And we wrote a piece about this on the cusp of an economic singularity, I believe was the title. This was a seminal event, and one that should not have been taken so lightly or so flippantly on our side. We just decided that we're going to go ahead and take Putin's reserves. Well, it seems like there's a lack of second and third order thinking, perhaps, amongst the current slate of Western leaders as to what might happen as a consequence of such moves. And so we shall see. But this is, of course, depending on how one chooses to read history, previous attempts to catalyze a de-dollarization of the energy markets has led to war. And here we are at war, and we have pressures in Taiwan. And maybe this is the one time where it's a coincidence, but yeah, the rest of the world would like to have the privilege of being able to print their own energy. And the recent behavior on our side is undoubtedly catalyzing once again a potential, multi-country effort to create a new system. And in that system, you need something, some commodity, or some basket of currency. Back to sort of the Bretton Woods, and Zoltan has been writing about this, quite eloquently for some time. If half the world decides that they're just going to transact amongst themselves outside of the US dollar system, they need something, and gold is, potentially that something.
Mm-hmm. So how does that, to you, how does that tie into Brent Johnson's milkshake theory? Does the spike in the US dollar come before that transition happens?
Yeah. So again, I leave it to Brent to articulate the particulars of his theory. And we quoted his work in our piece. And our view is this is driven by energy. So if you look at the DXY, 83% of it is composed of the euro, the British pound, and the yen. Mm-hmm. And all three of those regions, let's call them, because they're actually three different sort of entities, are deeply short energy. And so it's not surprising to us that their currencies are weakening because they can't print their own energy. And so if you look at sort of, again, it's a controversial thing, but if you compare the US dollar against the ruble's doing just fine and cutting interest rates as fast as it can because Russia is an energy superpower. Mm-hmm. And so sort of the path function of how this goes from A to B, in Brent's view, it involves sort of a supernova of appreciation in the US dollar. But eventually, I think he and Luke agree on what the end state will be, which is an entirely different system. And so, they tend to go back and forth. I'd say argue is the wrong word. They tweet at each other an awful lot, and I'm still trying to figure out what they're arguing about because it seems to me like they agree on a lot more than they disagree. But I love both of them, respect both of their work, have great relationships with both of them, and respect them as content creators. And in Brent's case, actually runs a fund, I believe. So.
Mm-hmm. So, another seemingly unbelievably short-sighted set of policies contributing what could be called a perfect storm coming in agricultural markets is, there's so many factors that are really playing into what could be called that perfect storm. So we saw the protests in the Netherlands by farmers, but it's a bigger problem globally rather than just the headline grabbing Netherlands. So let's try and talk through some of the issues that are contributing to that perfect storm coming in the agricultural markets and what some of the ramifications are going to be.
Well, at the sort of primary level, the key inputs into agriculture are nothing more than, solid or liquid forms of energy. And so by extension, if you are in the middle of an energy crisis, you must, by association, also have an agriculture crisis. And food is the ultimate sort of inelastic product. And so the perfect storm is, natural gas is a key input into fertilizer. Fertilizer is a key input into crop yields. Many of the primary herbicides that are used in the market, they're made from ammonia or similar nitrogen-containing compounds. And then diesel, of course, which is used on the farm, water, and there's massive drought around the world. And then on top of that, if the import-export market is not properly policed, and historically that had been the job of the US Navy, you get sort of a deglobalization of the food market, which is very high friction, right? And so when you put all that together, you're seeing already, right? I mean, some of the early victims, Sri Lanka and so on, but we suspect in the next 3 to 6 months, especially if the conflict in Ukraine drags on, as all indications appear that it will be, we're going to see pretty significant challenges in that space. And by the way, as inflation rears its ugly head, the relatively wealthy Western world will pay the clearing price. And that clearing price will be out of reach for billions of people. And so it's a scary time. Again, we're Doomberg, and we don't want to be alarmist. We would love nothing more than to come back a year from now and for you to say that we were alarmist because we're not cheering for this to happen. Mm-hmm. We would rather be wrong. But that's the thing about the European energy crisis that sort of makes me scratch my head when I see people on Twitter saying that we're going to get through the winter. Like, well, yeah, but what does that mean? Right?
Again, that's a low bar.
Yeah. And there's going to be enough calories. Okay. But at what price? And who gets to buy it? And then what are the second and third order consequences? Like, as we've argued, that the Western world is least prepared for such turmoil because they're used to light switches leading to light, and pushing buttons on a phone means food shows up at my door. When all that goes away, which society is hard enough to get through that? The society that's been through that 10 other times, or the society that is filled with people that have never had to go through it? So yeah, we're bearish for sure.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point of societies that are used to going through that hardship and maybe have developed some of the systems that are needed to be able to get through times like that, whether it be, let's say, wood burning stove, or just even the knowledge of how to procure calories or just food in general without, as you said, ordering it on a phone.
Well, I'll give you a personal example. I mean, love my children, who doesn't? But I much to the chagrin of my son, I force him to come with me and stack some wood sometimes. We're going to go ahead and this is a standing dead tree, and we're going to take it down, and we're going to cut the logs to size, and then we're going to split them, and we're going to stack them, and we're going to have a giant pile of wood right here if we need it. Mm-hmm. And, he looks at me and rolls his eyes and, probably enjoys the father-son time, but this is so far away from his world. And the first thing he does when we get back home is jump on his computer and play his online video games and text his friends on his iPhone. But I'm sure he thinks I'm silly for forcing him, quote unquote, to do that. But in my mind, I feel like that's an important exercise and an important lesson to pass on to your children, which is, the fundamentals of energy and the fundamentals of preparedness. And doing hard work outside without any devices in your hand is sort of a rare thing these days. And so in the countries where that's not a rare thing, and it's just a known part of the culture, which two countries are better prepared for a true crisis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an excellent point. And, hopefully you don't end up being forced to use that, but use the wood. But like you say, it's there if you need it, right?
Well, between amongst his friends, he would be the most prepared because at least he's seen wood, he's seen how to use a wood splitter and what's the appropriate size that you should look for, and what is dry wood that you can burn now, and how do you season? Look, these are all, we've sort of slipped in a branch here, pardon the pun, but I tell this story and I make this point because if you're put in a situation where you have to sort of take a few steps back and you have absolutely no idea how to do it, then what happens next?
A very hard transition, I have a feeling.
Yeah.
You recently wrote an article titled Transition to Nowhere, and it brings up the point that we keep coming to seemingly over and over, that we aren't willing to invest in the projects and metals to actually transition to the level of electric vehicle adoption that environmentalists claim is required to make the difference for climate change. So whether it be mining lithium, copper, nickel, or cobalt, or building enough electricity generation and transmission capacity to power the green utopia, at what point do you think reality will sink in and start to actually come to a head where politicians and the average person are going to do something about it?
So the article that you reference is a story that we told about a significant lithium deposit that was found in Maine. And that mine's never going to be developed. I mean, you've read the article.
And significant almost seems like an understatement.
Yeah, it's a big deposit and it's a high quality deposit. And, we open the piece by telling the story of a beautiful ski resort, which is less than 10 miles away. And I'm sure that if you and I perused the parking lot of the ski resort in the winter, we'd find more than a couple of Teslas. That's sort of like vanity in our view. Like these are sort of people that would like to virtue signal, but aren't actually prepared to do the dirty work and the heavy lifting needed to make meaningful change in our transportation sector. And it's just a story that could write itself and sort of right down the middle for us. That mine is never going to be developed because the same environmentalists who are demanding that we outlaw internal combustion engines are the ones chaining themselves to, statues to stop the development of mines just like this that are absolutely needed to do it. And so your question is, when will the hypocrisy sort of lead to the median voter, to steal a phrase from Marco Popic? When will the median voter realize that this is basically a giant con? We shall see. The price of lithium has exploded, of course, and the price of nickel and cobalt and all of these things are only going to get worse as mandates roll higher and higher, and then something has to break. And so it's fascinating and scary to imagine that even today, with these two pipelines severely damaged, Germany's saying, well, we might reconsider our nuclear policy. Like, how much pain does a civilized, developed Western nation need to endure before they decide it's probably important to open up a physics book? Like, this is provably, demonstrably, irrefutably true. What you said, which is we will not have enough lithium, cobalt, and nickel to make a meaningful dent on the proportion of our vehicles that are propelled by batteries. Period. Full stop. Anybody who says otherwise is either ignorant or lying, probably the former. Most people are true believers and don't know that it's a grift. And they're the most dangerous ones, of course, because they, convincing somebody they've been fooled is very hard. Mm-hmm. But again and again, at every opportunity, when we open that piece with a great quote from Thomas Sowell, who says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Mm-hmm. And in the green utopia, as you described it, there are no trade-offs. Literally, electricity is immaculately produced and batteries just magically appear. And it's a cake that bakes itself and the ingredients are free. So, that's not reality. Reality must be confronted at some point. And one potential positive, silver lining, let's call it, of the German sort of complete idiocy as it pertains to their energy policy. At least now we're going to run the experiment and we're going to see what happens. Like, we will have a irrefutable case study of what getting it all catastrophically wrong gets you. Whether or not the people on the sort of the side of the aisle that fantasize about this utopia will internalize that lesson appropriately remains to be seen. And, this congresswoman who was demanding to know whether all the banks would immediately stop funding fossil fuel development was an incredible spectacle in the US and tells us that we have a lot more pain to suffer before these people are flushed away from our political system and replaced with adults.
Well, it seems like we're on a path to more childlike behavior and seemingly getting worse by the election cycle. And, the incentive to be an adult and actually face these realities head on, that's what makes me wonder, when is the average person going to want to do something about this? And as you said, the case study, I think, is going to be an unfortunate one, because very likely the narrative that is going to be written around why all of these things happened to the average person is probably going to be misleading and present the wrong cause for these shortfalls and the issues that ended up causing the problems that they're facing, right?
Yeah, it's going to test the resilience of political institutions, is the best that I can say. Mm-hmm. People have been sold such a lie, and the propaganda around it has been so thick that the reconnection to physics is going to be a very, very painful one. And we doubt it will be peaceful, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. We shall see. We have this test case in Italy where the right wing won a landslide election, and we shall see what happens to the future of the EU. And, it's a tumultuous time. It's a scary time, if I'm being fully honest. Mm-hmm. And one hopes that there is a sort of a peaceful path function to a better, more logical world. But hope is not a very good strategy, as you know.
Absolutely. The other side of that coin that I think is worth talking about is that when, maybe if the solutions are recognized and, let's say, Germany wants to go back to burning more natural gas and more nuclear energy generation, that's not exactly a light switch that it can just flick and all of their problems are going to be solved the next day, right?
Yeah, but there is some value in political signaling, and they have, depending on how these reactors that they've just turned off can be turned back on, and if they made a national commitment to it. But yeah, like some of these, again, some of the die is cast on a lot of this stuff. We're going to run the experiment. This is why the destruction of these pipelines is such a critical event in our view, because it closes off options. Mm-hmm. And as we're talking, my Bloomberg terminal is scrolling by and I see a headline out of Sweden that from a seismologist at a university, we are very certain these were explosions. This was not an earthquake or a landslide. Assessment is that the second bigger explosion corresponded to more than 100 kilos of dynamite.
Wow.
This is a big deal. The die is cast. This removes any sort of potential for negotiation, we believe, that matter, because it's not like Russia can get more molecules to Europe if peace is achieved. It's not like the Germans will have any motivation now to sue for peace because, that's a valve that's been closed off to them. And so, yeah, I think there comes a point of no return. And then the question becomes, if you're going to allocate these limited molecules, what are the forces are you going to, how are you going to do that? And market forces would be the best one, but they're not doing that either. And so by understandably bailing out, mom and pop's businesses and residences, then you're going to necessarily short people who need those molecules for society for other reasons. And then who knows? I mean, this is truly unprecedented, and it's going to be pretty incredible. It's amazing that you and I are recording this as the news is breaking so quickly, but I wanted to just sort of give you a quick update of the latest headline that flashed through my screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, you actually brought up the quote that I wanted to bring up and ask you if you can give me another example of there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And of course, that was Thomas Sowell that wrote that. And George Gammon, I've heard him say that many times, but that seems to be a wonderful rule of economics that is so prescient in this time. So is there another example of that you can point to?
Yeah, the classic one is this relentless focus on nuclear waste, for example. Mm-hmm. Yes, nuclear waste is a challenge. For that challenge, there exists very robust solutions. The costs are quantifiable and manageable. And yet it is blown out of all proportion in this zealous effort to cancel nuclear power. And I would point to the fact that solar panels can't be recycled effectively today. And that, solar panels are made using slave labor in China and cheap, dirty thermal coal. So your sort of quote green energy, just because you call it green doesn't mean it is green. But that's the politics of the day, which is there are no downsides to solar and wind, and there are no upsides to fossil fuels and nuclear power. And that is an unscientific framing of the problem, which will lead to terrible solutions. It's just that simple. And so which of the energy trade-offs do you want to make? Do you want to have solar panels made by slaves and the energy required to make them derived from the dirtiest fuel on the planet? Or do you want to handle some nuclear waste? Mm-hmm. Which is the trade-off? You could have arguments for both, I suppose. We've considered them all, and we side on we land on the side of nuclear power, of course, because any scientist with any decent understanding of physics has to, in our view. But that's just our view, right? There are scientists with a decent understanding of physics who disagree with us, and that's fine. But there are no solutions. There is no perfect solution. So the amount of primary energy we produce dictates the integrated standard of living of humanity. If we produce less primary energy, standards of living have to come down in aggregate. And so does the integral of standard of living we can create for humanity matter to you? Like, is that a parameter? Is that a trade-off? Could we make do with less in your view? Okay, well, who gets to decide that, and who has to make do with less? Do the elites who are traveling to Martha's Vineyard on private jets and are the biggest proponents of the no trade-off fantasy, are they the ones that get to make do with less, or is it me and you? Is it the median citizen of an emerging economy who's fighting every day to get just enough food to persist? Are they the ones that will have to make do? Our view on this is that these policies, which are really sort of anti-human, is you first. Yeah. If you think that the world is using too much CO2, cut yours to zero. I mean, it's just that simple.
Yeah. Whether it's going to Martha's Vineyard on a private jet or Davos, or even the climate change conferences that we see all across the world where private jets are flown into, that idea of you first is incredibly simple, yet never even addressed by those that are pushing these policies.
And look, I have the first to admit, I live in the United States and achieved some semblance of success. And I have a large carbon footprint. I do. Because that is essentially a measure of my standard of living. But I'm not telling everyone else they need to shrink theirs. Yeah.
Yep.
And there are ways to shrink our carbon footprint, by the way, as we've outlined. And if we have decided collectively, and it might even be the best decision, that we want to organize our economy across the following equation: the amount of standard of living we can create divided by our carbon emissions. That's a great optimization function. But you can't just look at carbon emissions without looking at the numerator.
Yeah.
And so that ratio might be something we would want to optimize. And there are intelligent ways to do that require very little technical invention. Mm-hmm. They include a massive renaissance with nuclear power, a systemic replacement of coal with natural gas, using, in the US's case, our bounty of natural gas to make polysilicon so we can make solar panels, and continue to invest in the development of alternative technologies in the energy sector so that if we ever do get a major breakthrough, we can quickly implement it. Mm-hmm. But nuclear power has an energy payback period of 6 weeks. It's carbon free effectively. Now we have to build the transmission lines and all those other things that the environmentalists oppose at every opportunity. And so at their core, these people do not want a higher numerator. They just want a lower denominator, which means a lot more dead people. And let's just call it what it is. They are anti-human Malthusians.
Yeah, it really comes back to the idea of incentives. I had Mark Nelson on the show, who's a major proponent for nuclear energy. And he brought up something that had never occurred to me until he brought it up, that it was actually could have been some of the oil companies and, let's say by extension, even some of the, let's say, green energy advocates that have participated in some of the negative narrative spinning against nuclear energy that has created this facade of it being completely negative. And as you pointed out, it's not necessarily the perfect solution, but it is very likely one of the best trade-off equations that we can make.
And let's be very clear. We know that, like, the oil and gas sector has done a lot of really bad things in its history. And one of them is attacking nuclear power by funding anti-nuclear power green movements. I believe this is just sort of a historical fact. And the oil and gas industry has a lot of other problems, like a history of pollution and corruption and foreign bribes. And a lot of wars were fought over oil and gas. We're not here saying that the oil and gas companies have been perfect. They have lots of warts and have done themselves no favors in the political public relations game that is ongoing today. And again, this is why people think, like, for example, that we're bullish energy. We want oil and gas prices to be low, because low oil and gas prices means an abundance of energy, which means more humans can prosper. And we're pro-nuclear power because the trade-off of dealing with a small amount of nuclear waste is de minimis compared to the trade-offs of all other energy sources, oil and gas included.
Well, Doomberg, I want to really thank you for an excellent and really wide-ranging conversation. You guys do an incredible job of covering all of these different topics that are really interconnected and do affect everybody's lives on the day-to-day level. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on before we wrap up here?
No, I think it's great. I really enjoyed it. And again, just to remind everybody, the news will flow between when we recorded this and when we publish it. And I suspect what we have said today will prove to be mostly correct. And it is truly a dangerous time. And I would just say that, I mean, be very blunt, we pray for peace. We are anti-war, pro-human flourishing. And the war is a terrible thing. We hope that the de-escalation is on the horizon and peace will prevail.
Yeah, it seems kind of ridiculous that you have to explicitly state that you are pro-human. But as we said, there are all these trade-offs. And when you think about, trying to move to, for the first time in world history, a less efficient form of energy, as you said, that necessarily equates to more dead people, right?
Yeah. And not trying to be morbid, but we're going to make a trade-off. We need to understand what those trade-offs are. So that's probably a great place to end it.
Of course, you guys are available on Twitter at DoombergT and doomberg.substack.com, where your guys' excellent articles are. Doomberg, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate you spending a bit of time with me on such a busy and important day.
It was fabulous. Anytime it was too long in between, and let's do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.